If you had asked me a year ago, I would have described my life as unshakable. My marriage to Catherine felt like the kind people envied, solid, warm, and built on a decade of trust. We had a rhythm that others seemed to admire. Quiet dinners, shared dreams, and the kind of laughter that softened the edges of life's hardships. Then there was my cousin, Lucas. He wasn't just family, he was my best friend. The bond we shared felt like an unspoken pact, unbreakable and unconditional. The three of us had created a world that felt invincible. Lucas was like a brother to me, a confidant who knew me better than most. Where I was steady and introspective, Lucas was magnetic and unpredictable. People were drawn to him, including Catherine. Their friendship had always been light and playful, a natural byproduct of the close-knit relationship we shared. I never questioned it. Why would I? They were two of the people I trusted most in the world. It began with subtle changes, the kind you don't notice until they start to accumulate. Lucas started visiting more often. At first, it was sporadic, a quick coffee, a dropped-off package, a friendly invitation to join him for drinks. But as the months passed, his presence became almost routine. He'd show up unannounced, his easy charm brushing away any sense of intrusion. Looking back, I can see the signs that should have stopped me in my tracks. Catherine's laughter seemed brighter when Lucas was around, her demeanor softer, more vibrant. I dismissed it as harmless camaraderie, a reflection of Lucas's natural charisma. But now I wonder if I was simply blind to what was right in front of me. Catherine, too, began to change. She grew distant, her phone glued to her hand and her once-open nature replaced by a guarded hesitance. I chalked it up to stress from her new role as a senior event planner at a prestigious hotel. The long hours, the endless calls, and the mounting pressure seemed like reasonable explanations for her sudden reserve. I told myself it was temporary, that things would go back to normal. But deep down, the unease had already begun to take root. The first undeniable clue came one Saturday morning. Catherine had left her phone on the kitchen counter while stepping out to grab groceries. It buzzed with a notification, and I glanced over out of habit. The preview on the screen froze me in place. "I miss you already. Can't wait for the next time. L." My breath caught as my mind scrambled to make sense of it. L could mean anything. Lucas wasn't the only person with that initial. But the words felt intimate, too close, too deliberate. When Catherine returned, I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. The doubts started to compound. I began noticing the quick glances between them, the private jokes I wasn't part of, the sudden silences when I entered the room. Even Lucas's visits began to feel calculated, his excuses flimsy and poorly timed. It was as if they were sharing a secret they couldn't quite contain. One night, after Catherine had gone to bed, I gave in to the gnawing suspicion and checked her phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages. Most were mundane, work updates, conversations with friends. But then I found the thread with Lucas. Their messages began innocently enough, filled with jokes and casual updates. But as I read further, the tone shifted. There were inside jokes I didn't understand, veiled references to moments they had shared without me, and messages that hinted at meetings I hadn't known about. I can't stop thinking about that night. Felt so right. Me too. I hate sneaking around, but I love every second with you. The words felt like a punch to the chest. The bond one had taken for granted, the trust one thought was unshakable, had been fractured. I didn't confront Catherine immediately. Instead, I turned my focus to Lucas. I began observing him with the same careful scrutiny I had once reserved for Catherine. I noticed the way he lingered in conversations with her, the way his tone shifted when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Patterns began to emerge, suspicious coincidences that, when pieced together, painted an unmistakable picture. The final blow came one evening when Catherine claimed she was meeting a colleague for dinner. Her tone was rehearsed, her movements deliberate. I followed her, staying a safe distance behind as she drove across town to a secluded restaurant. She parked, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. Minutes later, Lucas arrived. They greeted each other with a familiarity that pierced through any lingering doubts. From my car, I watched them sit at a corner table, their heads close together, their laughter carried faintly on the breeze. I couldn't bear to watch any longer. I took photos, shaking hands gripping my phone, and drove away. My mind raced with anger, disbelief, and a profound sadness. How had it come to this? The two people I loved most in the world had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind replayed the moments I had overlooked, the warnings I had dismissed. The betrayal felt suffocating, but amidst the turmoil, a clarity began to form. I couldn't let their actions define me. If they had chosen to betray me, then they would have to face the consequences of their choices. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew one thing. This wasn't over. The morning after I uncovered their betrayal, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee. The weight of the evidence I had collected, the photos, the messages, the undeniable proof, pressed on me like a physical burden. Laura moved around the house, humming softly as if nothing had changed. Her demeanor was so calm, so ordinary, that it almost made me question everything I had seen. But the images burned into my memory wouldn't let me. Ethan remained the same as well. He continued to stop by unannounced, his easy laughter and casual charm filling the spaces that felt emptier by the day. Every interaction between him and Laura now felt amplified, like a spotlight had been placed on their every glance, every shared smile. Their confidence in my ignorance was galling, but it also gave me clarity. They truly believed they had hidden their betrayal well, but the cracks were more visible than ever. In the days that followed, I became an observer in my own life. Laura carried on with her routines, texting me about grocery lists and errands, sitting beside me on the couch at night while scrolling through her phone. Her interactions felt hollow, mechanical, as though she was performing the role of a wife while her mind was elsewhere. Ethan's presence was a constant reminder of the deception. He acted as though nothing had changed, his demeanor as confident and relaxed as ever. He still joked with me, still asked about my day, still brought takeout over for dinner. But his timing was too perfect, his visits too convenient, aligning with Laura's unusually high spirits or her sudden bursts of energy. I began to see their patterns clearly. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It was the emotional intimacy they shared. They had built a rhythm of their own, one that excluded me entirely. With Mark's help, I delved deeper into their secrets. Mark had always been resourceful, and when I explained what I had uncovered, he immediately offered his assistance. Together, we accessed Laura's phone and laptop. The evidence was damning. Hidden among the mundane threads and work emails was a message chain between her and Ethan. Their exchanges began innocuously, but the familiarity in their tone became more evident the further we looked. There were references to secret dinners, inside jokes, and moments that should never have existed between them. Even worse, they had spoken about me. The messages revealed their shared confidence in my ignorance, their laughter at my expense. Reading their words was like pouring salt on an open wound. The betrayal wasn't just about their connection. It was about the lengths they had gone to protect it at my expense. Confrontation wasn't enough. I needed more than just the emotional satisfaction of exposing them. I needed a plan that would hold them accountable for what they had done. Mark and I began to piece together everything. The photos I had taken, the messages we had found, and the patterns that had emerged from their interactions. Mark suggested surveillance as the next step. Together, we installed discrete cameras in the living room, kitchen, and backyard. These were places where Laura and Ethan often lingered, talking and laughing as though the space belonged to them. The cameras weren't just for confirmation. They were for gathering undeniable proof. It didn't take long for the cameras to capture what I had feared. Laura told me one evening that she was meeting a friend for dinner. Her tone was light, almost dismissive, as if the idea of suspicion hadn't crossed her mind. I nodded, pretending to believe her, and watched her leave. Within an hour, Ethan arrived. Using the spare key I had once trusted him with, he let himself in. Shortly after, Laura returned, her laughter echoing through the hallways as the two of them settled in the living room. They sat close together, speaking in hushed tones, their comfort with one another on full display. The footage confirmed everything I already knew, but seeing it unfold in my own home brought a new level of pain. They had taken the place I had built as a sanctuary and turned it into their meeting ground. I waited until the weekend, inviting Ethan over for a casual barbecue. Laura was there, of course, playing the role of the gracious hostess. We sat together on the patio, the three of us engaging in polite conversation as if nothing had changed. When the moment felt right, I retrieved the folder where I had compiled the evidence. I placed it on the table between us, the weight of it heavier than the sum of its parts. Ethan's smile faltered as he noticed the folder, his easy confidence replaced by a flicker of unease. Laura's expression froze, her eyes darting between me and the folder as she seemed to piece together what was happening. The silence stretched as they leafed through the photos and messages, their shock and guilt evident in every movement. Laura's hand trembled as she reached for the documents, while Ethan's expression darkened, his usual charm nowhere to be found. For the first time, they were faced with the full extent of their actions, and there was no room for denial or excuses. The power they thought they held had shifted, and I was no longer the one being deceived. I left them at the table, unable to listen to whatever half-hearted justifications or apologies they might have offered. My confrontation wasn't about closure, it was about reclaiming control over a situation they had stolen from me. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm wasn't over, but I was no longer caught in its center. Laura and Ethan had played their game, but they hadn't anticipated the consequences. In the aftermath of Ethan's departure and Laura's persistent apologies, life became a careful balancing act between pain and progress. Every day brought moments of clarity and fresh waves of grief. My home, once a place of comfort and security, felt like a hollow echo of the life I had thought was unshakable. Laura's continued presence in the house was a constant reminder of the fracture in our relationship. While I avoided her as much as possible, her efforts to repair the damage became a fixture of my daily life. She left handwritten notes apologizing and took on tasks around the house she had once overlooked, but each gesture felt more like an act of desperation than a genuine bridge to repair what was broken. At night, we occupied separate rooms, the silence between us louder than any argument could have been. I found myself replaying the confrontation in my mind, analyzing every word, every expression. It felt surreal to think that my wife and brother, the two people I had trusted above all else, had been the architects of my heartbreak. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when the chaos had settled into a kind of uneasy rhythm, that I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The caller was Ethan's former girlfriend, a woman named Marissa. Her voice was steady, though it carried the weight of something significant. She had heard about the fallout from mutual friends and thought it was time I knew the truth about Ethan's past. Marissa described a pattern of behavior that mirrored what I had experienced. Ethan's charm had drawn her in, his charisma making it easy to overlook the red flags. But over time, she had come to see the manipulation, the selfishness, and the way he prioritized his own desires over the well-being of those around him. She spoke of friendships he had sabotaged, lies he had told, and other relationships he had betrayed in pursuit of fleeting gratification. Her account painted a picture of a man who thrived on control and deceit, a man who was all too familiar with crossing boundaries for his own gain. The revelation didn't come as a shock, but it cemented my resolve. Ethan's betrayal wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was part of a long-standing pattern. Marissa's words gave me the clarity I needed to make the difficult decision to cut Ethan out of my life completely. I blocked his number, deleted his contact information, and instructed friends not to mention him in conversations with me. It wasn't an easy choice. He was my brother after all, but it was a necessary one. I couldn't allow him to manipulate his way back into my life. Laura, however, was a different matter. Her actions had been devastating, but they lacked the calculated malice that defined Ethan's behavior. She continued to express remorse, attending counseling sessions and attempting to make amends in small ways. Part of me wanted to believe she could change, that our marriage could be salvaged. But trust, once shattered, doesn't mend easily. I threw myself into rebuilding the parts of my life that had nothing to do with Ethan or Laura. I picked up hobbies I had long abandoned: photography, running, even volunteering at a local animal shelter. These activities became an outlet, a way to reclaim my identity and create new memories that weren't tied to the betrayal. Mark remained a steadfast presence, encouraging me to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. He reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line, that it was okay to have setbacks as long as I kept moving forward. His words, though simple, became a mantra I repeated to myself on the hardest days. One evening, as Laura and I shared the same space for the first time in weeks, she asked if we could talk. Her voice was soft, hesitant, and I could see the toll the past weeks had taken on her. I agreed, though I kept my expectations low. Laura spoke candidly, her words measured but earnest. She admitted that the affair had been a symptom of deeper issues she hadn't known how to address. She felt lost in her own life, unsure of her identity outside of our marriage. Ethan's attention had filled a void, offering a sense of validation she hadn't realized she craved. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright. Instead, she expressed a desire to take accountability and to find a way to rebuild herself, whether or not we stayed together. Her honesty caught me off guard, and for the first time since the confrontation, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with. Over the next few weeks, Laura and I navigated the difficult process of deciding what our future would look like. Counseling sessions became a place to unpack our shared history, to understand the cracks in our foundation that had allowed betrayal to take root. In the end, we both came to the same conclusion. Our marriage couldn't survive. The wounds were too deep, the trust too broken. But we parted on a note of mutual respect, acknowledging that we had both played a role in the unraveling of what we once had. As the dust settled, I found myself at a crossroads. The life I had known was gone, but in its place was a blank slate, an opportunity to rebuild on my own terms. I continued to focus on myself, surrounding myself with people who uplifted me and pursuits that brought me joy. Ethan remained a ghost of my past, a reminder of what happens when trust is taken for granted. Laura became a distant but amicable presence, someone whose story was intertwined with mine, but whose chapter had come to an end. For the first time in a long time, I felt free, not free of pain or regret, but free to move forward without the weight of betrayal holding me back. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again, and that was enough. In the wake of the confrontation, life felt like a suspended moment, one where each breath was heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. The layers of Laura's betrayal, once thought to be merely emotional and physical, had now revealed an even darker truth. A partnership with Ethan that extended beyond personal indiscretion into calculated financial deceit. The documents Camille had provided became my roadmap to understanding the scope of what had transpired. Ethan's fraudulent schemes weren't just a string of bad decisions. They were meticulously planned cons, each victim carefully chosen for their potential to invest without asking too many questions. Laura's role had been pivotal. Her position at work and her credibility had lent legitimacy to Ethan's operations, making it easier for him to lure in unsuspecting participants. Camille's discovery of bank transfers between Laura and Ethan confirmed a truth I had feared but hadn't fully grasped. Laura wasn't just an accomplice by circumstance. She had been complicit in his plans, her actions deliberate even if fueled by manipulation. The pain I felt at her betrayal deepened. This wasn't just a matter of infidelity. It was a violation of every value I thought we shared. The Laura I thought I knew, my partner, my equal, had been complicit in something that went against the very core of who I was. When I confronted Laura again, the atmosphere in our home shifted from tense to unbearable. The folder on the counter was no longer just evidence of personal betrayal but a tangible representation of her involvement in Ethan's schemes. She read through the documents, her hands trembling, her expression a mix of shame and despair. Her confession was halting, fragmented by tears and long silences. She admitted that Ethan had painted the fraud as a way to secure financial freedom, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to escape the grind of everyday life. He had used his charm and our shared history to draw her in, assuring her that no one would get hurt and that the rewards would be worth the risks. Laura described how the line between professional and personal had blurred as Ethan's influence grew. By the time she realized the full extent of what she had become involved in, she felt trapped, her life and decisions spiraling out of her control. Her tears, her regret, it all felt real, but it didn't make the truth any easier to bear. The revelation that law enforcement was investigating Ethan added a new layer of urgency. If Laura's involvement came to light, her professional life would be destroyed, and she could face legal consequences. The house, already suffocating under the weight of betrayal, now carried the specter of potential scandal and ruin. When I shared this information with Laura, she broke down completely. She pleaded for my support, begging me to help her navigate the fallout. Her desperation was raw, her fear palpable. But standing by her meant tethering myself to the wreckage of her decisions, sacrificing my own sense of morality and justice for the sake of loyalty. I sought solace in Mark's unrelenting pragmatism. He listened as I recounted every detail, his expression a mix of disbelief and quiet anger. "She made her choices," he said simply. "You need to decide if you can live with them, or if it's time to let her face the consequences alone." His words resonated, forcing me to confront the reality of my situation. Laura's pleas for forgiveness were heartfelt, but could I trust her again? Could I rebuild a life with someone who had so willingly betrayed everything we stood for? As if the situation couldn't get worse, Camille reached out with another revelation. Ethan had fled. Law enforcement had been closing in, and rather than face the consequences, he had disappeared, leaving Laura and his other accomplices to deal with the fallout. His escape felt like the final betrayal, a reminder that he had used everyone in his orbit as pawns in his selfish game. Laura was now squarely in the crosshairs of the investigation. Without Ethan to hold accountable, the authorities would likely turn their focus on her, scrutinizing her every action and decision. That evening, I returned home to find Laura sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, her eyes brimming with tears. She told me she had contacted a lawyer, that she was preparing to cooperate fully with the authorities in the hope of reducing any potential charges. Her decision to come clean felt like a step in the right direction, but it also underscored the depth of her betrayal. She had put us both in this position, and now she was asking me to stand by her as she faced the consequences of her actions. I couldn't give her the answer she wanted. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go. It was about finding a way forward that honored my own values and sense of self. And as much as I wanted to believe she could change, the scars she had left were too deep. I packed my belongings that night, the act of leaving both painful and liberating. Laura didn't try to stop me. Perhaps she knew there was nothing left to say. As I walked out the door, the weight of the past weeks lifted slightly, replaced by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild. The road was uncertain, marked by moments of doubt and flashes of anger. But it was my road to walk, unburdened by the lies and manipulations that had once defined my world. Laura's future was her own to navigate, her choices hers to answer for. As for Ethan, his shadow no longer loomed over me. He was a ghost of my past, a reminder of the lessons I had learned and the strength I had discovered within myself. For the first time in months, I felt free not from pain, but from the grip of betrayal. The journey wasn't over, but I was ready to face whatever came next. The night I left the house, it felt like stepping into an abyss. The weight of Laura's betrayal and Ethan's manipulation hung over me, suffocating yet oddly liberating. For weeks, I had wrestled with the idea of leaving, clinging to the remnants of a life that no longer existed. Now, as I drove aimlessly through the city streets, my mind raced with questions. How had it come to this? How had I missed the signs? And most importantly, where would I go from here? The first few days were a blur. I stayed at Mark's place, grateful for his no-questions-asked support. His spare room became my refuge, a place where I could begin to untangle the mess my life had become. Mark, ever the pragmatist, reminded me that healing wouldn't be linear. "One step at a time," he said, and I clung to those words like a lifeline. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach Laura. A week after I left, federal agents showed up at the house with subpoenas and search warrants. Ethan's fraudulent schemes had finally caught up with him, and Laura's financial ties to him made her a person of interest. She called me in a panic, her voice trembling as she begged for help. But what could I do? Her choices had led her here, and I wasn't sure I had the strength or the desire to save her from the consequences. From what I later learned, Ethan had done what Ethan always did: looked out for himself. He had liquidated his assets and fled, leaving Laura and any remaining co-conspirators to face the music. His betrayal of her was as thorough as the one he had dealt me, and while a part of me felt a grim satisfaction, another part ached for the woman I had once loved. Camille became an unexpected ally during this time. Her insights into Ethan's behavior and her determination to expose his misdeeds were invaluable. She provided evidence that cleared Laura of deeper involvement in the scheme. While Laura had been complicit, her role was limited to acting as an unwitting accomplice, drawn in by Ethan's charm and promises. With Camille's help, Laura negotiated a plea deal. She agreed to testify against Ethan in exchange for leniency. Watching her take responsibility for her actions was bittersweet. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it showed me she was willing to face the consequences. Months passed before Ethan was finally captured. He had been hiding in a remote part of the country, living under an alias and using what little money he had left to maintain a facade of normalcy. His arrest made headlines, the story of his fraud and betrayal captivating the public. For me, it was a moment of closure. The man who had caused so much pain and chaos was finally being held accountable. During the trial, Ethan's charm and confidence crumbled under the weight of the evidence against him. Witness after witness came forward, detailing his lies and manipulations. Laura's testimony was a turning point. Her account of how he had drawn her into his web painting a damning picture. Watching her on the stand was surreal. She looked composed but broken, her voice steady as she recounted the choices that had led her there. Ethan was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The judge's words were harsh, condemning him for the lives he had ruined and the trust he had shattered. As he was led away in handcuffs, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. He was my brother, but he was also a stranger, someone I had never truly known. With Ethan's sentencing behind me, I turned my focus to rebuilding my life. The house that had once been a symbol of love and stability now felt tainted, so I sold it, using the money to start fresh in a smaller apartment across town. I cut ties with people who reminded me of the past and surrounded myself with friends who supported my healing. Laura and I finalized our divorce amicably. She expressed gratitude for the ways I had helped her, even as we both acknowledged that there was no path forward for us as a couple. The separation was painful, but it was also necessary. I couldn't move on while holding onto a relationship built on broken trust. Months later, as I settled into my new routine, I received a letter. It was from Ethan, written from prison. His words were a mix of apology and reflection, his tone uncharacteristically humble. He admitted to the harm he had caused and expressed regret for the choices that had led him there. But there was also a sense of resignation, as though he knew his apologies couldn't undo the damage. I debated whether to respond. Part of me wanted to write back, to demand answers and express my anger. But another part of me knew that no response would ever satisfy the questions I carried. In the end, I chose not to reply. Ethan's choices were his own, and I needed to focus on my path forward, not on his redemption. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the legal battles, they had tested me in ways I never thought possible. But they had also taught me about resilience, about the importance of boundaries, and about the strength it takes to rebuild after everything falls apart. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. My life was far from perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about the future. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew this. I had survived the storm, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. This wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was the one I had earned. And that, I realized, was enough.